Tonight, new fallout from the Trump immigration agenda. Moments ago, Trump announcing he's reached a deal with Guatemala to restrict asylum applications from Central America. We should note, however, that the Guatemalan Congress likely needs to sign off on the agreement first, so it's unclear whether this would go into effect, if at all. Now, this, as NBC News is reporting, active duty U.S. troops now stationed inside a Border Patrol facility in Texas, some saying they may be close to violating a federal law which prohibits the military from acting as a police force. And the Border Patrol chief in El Paso was just reassigned following reports showing unsafe and unsanitary conditions in nearby border stations. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by two U.S. senators who were just inside one of those detention centers in El Paso. But first, a look at how their colleagues in the House are addressing these issues, grilling the acting director of ICE over a number of troubling reports, including a story The Beat covered just last night. A U.S. citizen detained by Border Patrol officials for 23 days, despite presenting his state ID, his Social Security card, and his birth certificate. The ICE director telling Congress it's not in his authority to say who is or who is not a citizen. Watch this.
ICE does not have the lawful authority to say anybody is or is not a citizen. What we do is when we are provided with probative evidence that an individual in our custody looks to be a citizen, we will release that individual from custody.
What troubled me with your answer is that when someone looks to be a citizen, I've got a list here of 9. Guadalupe Plasencia from San Bernardino, from my community. You advance it when they look to be a citizen. It just strikes me that all of these individuals are Latinos, and that you're talking about how someone looks. So can you talk to me a little bit about this?
I was not referring to anybody's appearance, and that was clear if anybody listened to the context of what I was saying.
All right, so tonight, the Trump administration also expanding so-called expedited removals, claiming the power to deport any undocumented immigrant anywhere in the U.S. who can't prove that they've been here more than 2 years, potentially without ever even seeing a judge. I'm joined by Senators Mazie Hirono and Tim Kaine, who've been patiently standing by. We appreciate you guys talking to us this evening very much. You were just inside one of these facilities. Senator Hirono, what did you see?
We knew going to these facilities that there were not going to be the kinds of hundreds and hundreds of people that had been there even 6 months ago. But nonetheless, to see the cells, even the agents refer to these places as cells, is to realize that if there are 12 people, 13 people crammed, as have been the case in these cells, that is no way for us to be treating people who are just wanting to seek asylum in our country. So that's one thing. But what we see is a dysfunctional kind of system, and it starts with the president and his attitude toward others, especially immigrants. And he is doing everything he can to stymie the ability of people, mainly fleeing from the Northern Triangle countries, to seek asylum as they are legally entitled to do. He is doing everything he can. He's sending them to Mexico to await their asylum hearings. And now we understand that he wants them to go to Guatemala, one of the countries that so many people are fleeing from because it happens to be one of the murder capitals of the world. So it's as though he wants all these other countries to step up, but in the meantime, our country is not, and we are a country of immigrants.
Senator Kaine, I want to play some sound from a boy named Abner, 17 years old, interviewed by our own Julia Ainsley. This was an NBC News exclusive interview talking about the conditions that he faced inside of a facility. Let's take a listen to that.
Cuando nos tocaba que tomar agua en los chorros, pues, no nos daban con qué recibirnos, que con las manos, así todas sucias y como no nos daban ni siquiera un vasito ni en algo recibir. Nosotros a veces aunque sea nos lavamos algo las manos porque no teníamos ni con qué lavarnos, ni algún jabón ni nada. Así agarrábamos el agua y lo tomábamos porque no teníamos con qué recibirlo.
So, Senator Kaine, he's talking about the fact that he wasn't even given a cup to drink water with, which we know is incredibly essential, especially in climates like where he was being detained. He was given nothing to wash with, like soap. We have heard instances of not even a toothbrush for young children. What needs to change? What needs to happen to improve conditions in these detention facilities?
Well, Yasmin, we have to have minimum standards for them. The House passed a bill this week for health and safety standards for any of these facilities, and the Senate needs to act on those. Second, we have to fight against the kind of overcrowding we saw because we talked to families who had similar experiences, but as Senator Hono said, we were in a different posture because the attention that was put on these facilities has caused the government to dramatically reduce numbers. So the numbers have come down. So if you're in a facility that's run by Customs and Border Patrol, and it was built for 100 adults, and now they have 750 kids in facilities that aren't air conditioned, that are dangerous, where kids are, getting communicable diseases, and they can hardly isolate them from each other. They don't have the supplies to deal with the numbers. But here's the problem: CBP, after they do intake and they clear somebody, they call HHS and they say, we have a child that the Office of Refugee Resettlement has to pick up. HHS was saying, sorry, we can't do it. And so the numbers were growing and growing and growing in these facilities, and it was completely intolerable. So the first step was an important one. The attention that's been drawn by congressional visits, by journalists doing good work, has forced other agencies to start doing their job. So the numbers have come down. But the president's actions in, say, cutting off asylum claims and sending people back to unsafe locations, whether it's a single mom being forced to go back to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, or a family being sent back to Guatemala, you can't send somebody back to an unsafe location. So we have to fix those laws, insist upon minimum standards, and keep the public focus, attention, and pressure on so that these facilities are run in a way that would comport with American values.
So, Senator Hirono, what do you make of this? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I also saw that interview with that young man, and so we know that these facilities, the longer children are in these facilities, the more traumatized they are, and this can be lasting trauma. And so there are alternatives to detention. We don't need to have more and more children being deemed unaccompanied minors because we are so narrowly defining what a family member is and making them go through ever higher hoops so that the children do not have to be deemed unaccompanied minors and therefore in the custody of ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement. So there are a number of things that we need to do. But for the children who are being traumatized, we need to have social workers. We need to have child care experts available to talk to these kids. It's not just volunteer or nurses' aides, et cetera. We need professionals because we are damaging these children by the thousands with our policies.
Senator Kaine, what is your reaction to the news that this American citizen was improperly detained as an illegal immigrant?
It's of a piece with other things we've heard. Look, the policies of the administration, Yasmin, are right at the sort of nexus of cruelty and incompetence. So there's an intentional cruelty, and then there's also sort of an incompetence about, oh, wow, this guy had records that showed he was an American citizen, and we didn't pay attention to him. You saw the same thing in the family separation policy. They separated families, but they didn't keep good records about where the kids were going, so that here, a year after they've been ordered to reunite families, there's still children who are not able to be reunited with their families. So what the administration is doing is this sort of cruelty coupled with an incompetence that's leading to results like this American being detained for weeks, losing 26 pounds while in a detention. He never should have been in there in the first place. But that is an acceptable byproduct to the administration that is insisting upon these cruel and incompetent policies.
All right, while I both have you here, I got to ask you this question. House Democrats, as you well now know, now saying they're going to start an impeachment investigation, not an impeachment inquiry. Your own colleague, Senator Ed Markey, I believe yesterday stood on the Senate floor and said we need to start an impeachment inquiry. Senator Hirono, I'll start with you on this. What are your thoughts? Is it time?
I called for the Senate, for the House, to begin an impeachment inquiry the day that Robert Mueller gave his press conference, and making it very clear that the Russians had interfered with our elections big time. Two, that but for the Office of Legal Counsel's admonition, I think that they would have made a decision regarding indicting or charging a sitting president. And so I called for an impeachment inquiry about 3 months ago, I think.
I'm not surprised that more in the House are reaching the conclusion after Mueller's testimony. The testimony, I think, was pretty clear that, look, we were blocked from recommending an obstruction of justice charge by an OLC document. And Mueller has said when the normal legal process is blocked dealing with the president, the only remedy is a congressional remedy. And if you give conduct like this a free pass, then you've essentially said that there's no standard. The House isn't going to do what they're going to do. And Mazie and I are in the Senate. The Senate becomes a juror in something like this, and we would take it up if it came to us. But the Mueller testimony, elaborating on the report, demonstrates that there have been a whole series of breaches of the behavior that we would expect from the office in the most serious ways.
All right, Senators Tim Kaine, Mazie Hirono, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.